Since the Artemis Plan to create a permanent human presence on the lunar surface after 50 years of being absent was first conceived, there have been all kinds of criticism of various aspects of the program. For example, the Lunar Gateway space station that you're watching right now has come under fire on a regular basis for being completely unnecessary. That a moon direct program is always a simpler and better way to proceed with transporting humans to the lunar surface, and the space station is an unnecessary continuation of the International Space Station. Indeed, the only reason for its existence is so the mission control apparatus that's necessary to keep the ISS in operation can continue with the Lunar Gateway without any other real purpose. Although I strenuously disagree with this position, there's certainly a case to be made for the cancellation of the Lunar Gateway, but recently Congress has finally, at least publicly, come to the conclusion that the biggest Achilles heel of Artemis was the thing that was once looked upon as being the most solid and reliable aspect of the program, and that is the Starship HLS system, also known as Lunar Starship. According to Forbes magazine, congressional leaders backing NASA's master plan to be the first to land astronauts on the moon in the new millennium are becoming apprehensive that the U.S. could lose this future-shaping space race too. Just weeks after SpaceX conducted the 7th test flight of Starship, with its capsule spectacularly exploding over the Caribbean, followed by the 8th flight of Starship with similar results, the House of Representatives Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee staged a hearing focused on NASA's current scheme to deploy the Starship to speed space fares to the moon's south pole in 2027. In case you don't know, NASA has awarded SpaceX 2 contracts valued at over $4 billion for the experimental spacecraft to fly its Artemis astronauts to the ancient silver and black orb in a series of missions starting theoretically 2 years from now. And Congress has come to the conclusion, with the assistance of just about every expert in the field, at least those experts who don't work for SpaceX, that this plan has a very low probability of putting human beings on the moon by 2030, let alone 2027, and that another plan is absolutely vital and needs to be implemented as rapidly as possible. Starship is too complicated, its infrastructure too sophisticated and untested to believe that it's actually going to be able to get the job done in the next 5 years. That being the case, then, NASA needs another solution. And that solution actually exists right now and is a fair distance of the way to being a mature system. That is the Dynetics Alpaca, a vehicle that I've talked about many times on this channel, a vehicle that in my opinion was always the best selection, at least for the initial Artemis missions. And I'm going to tell all of you how it's still possible for Alpaca to get the job done by 2030 and return human beings to the lunar surface before China can do the same. All of this and more coming at you on The Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, spaceflight enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Bulletin here on The Angry Astronaut. For those of you who are a bit unfamiliar with NASA's plans for getting human beings back to the moon, I'm going to give you a quick review. It's a lot more complicated than it used to be with the old Apollo missions, and the reason for this is the Orion spacecraft that NASA now uses to get out to cislunar space is much larger than the old Apollo capsules and LEMs that were used during the time of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. They can carry 4 astronauts instead of 3, plus a lot more cargo and even a radiation shelter. That's something that the old Apollo capsules didn't have. But the added weight makes it impossible to get the Orion all the way to the lunar surface. There's no way to accomplish the same thing with Orion that was done with the original Apollo missions. That being the case, then, it was decided that something was needed in between, a stop-off point in lunar orbit that you're looking at right now called the Lunar Gateway. It includes laboratories, a habitation unit, a propulsion system, a power system, and also a couple of canadarms, just like the International Space Station. In my opinion, I think that this is a great idea for a number of reasons. I'm not going to get into all of the details now, but I think that maintaining a permanent place on the moon will be a lot easier to do if there's a space station in orbit supporting this permanent presence. And also having this drop-off point on the way provides an emergency stop-off point in the case of failed missions or some sort of malfunction, and it also serves as a quarantine lab for missions coming in from interplanetary destinations. For example, when we go to Mars, and in my opinion, almost definitely bring Mars bacteria back to Earth, it would be much better to bring this bacteria to the Lunar Gateway where it can be experimented on thoroughly before we risk bringing it back to Earth. This space station serves a wide variety of purposes and is not just an excuse to keep the old ISS staff and mission control people on payroll. It's much more useful than that. So the idea is to get Orion and 4 astronauts out to the Lunar Gateway, and then from there, a landing craft called the HLS, or Human Landing System, picks up the astronauts and transports them the rest of the way down to the lunar surface. The astronauts stay there for about a week or so and then travel back up to the Lunar Gateway utilizing the same HLS system. That's the only thing that HLS does, and yet doing that one job is an extremely complicated thing because you have to get the landing craft all the way out to the Lunar Gateway in the same way that Orion gets out there. And in the old days, the idea was to use SLS to deliver an HLS system separate to the SLS that delivered the Orion. However, as time went on, it became very clear that SLS was a ridiculously expensive and wasteful rocket, and there would be no way to budget for 2 SLS launches for every human mission to the lunar surface. There had to be cheaper ways to implement this solution, and those were the contracts that were originally proposed. Various ways of getting an HLS system out to the space station without using an SLS. And this is how Lunar Starship got proposed. A way to get an entire spacecraft capable of not just handling 4 astronauts, but large numbers of astronauts and enormous amounts of cargo out to cislunar space, where they would pick up the astronauts delivered by Orion, travel down to the lunar surface, and then return to the Lunar Gateway. Technically, Starship could eventually do the entire job, but at first, all it was supposed to do is handle the HLS part of the job. However, as time went on, it became clear that Starship, even though technically being less expensive, or at least theoretically a lot less expensive than SLS, it was far more complicated than the original plan. Getting a Starship out to the moon required at least 10 refueling missions, plus the deployment of a refueling depot in low Earth orbit, plus the deployment of the Lunar Starship to begin with. 12 launches of the biggest rocket in human history just to get one landing craft out to lunar orbit. That seemed to be a bit of a wasteful process, and something that I really thought wasn't going to be embraced by NASA years ago, before Starship was anywhere close from going on its first test flight. But I was wrong, because Elon proposed a price that was far, far less than either Blue Origin or their Dynetics competitors. SpaceX ended up winning the contract. And ever since then, Starship has been working against time, and every failed test has made it less and less likely that this rocket is going to be capable of doing the ambitious job that it was contracted to do years ago by 2027, or indeed even 2030. And so that's what brings us to the congressional testimony of Daniel Dumbacher, who formerly served as a Deputy Associate Administrator of NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate, in charge of the Artemis lunar mission. So, a man who has his finger on the pulse of the entire HLS program and where Lunar Starship is exactly with its development process. And he said the following, quote, "We might have to build a lander. We might have to scale down the current lander so that we can get to that 2030 landing. I'd get myself a simplified lander so I can get to the moon that does not require multiple launches. Approach today has a very low probability to match the before 2030 milestone for landing humans on the moon." Obviously, although Dumbacher did not mention the Starship, it's clear what he was talking about as being the big Achilles heel in the whole Artemis program. Because SLS is a mature rocket now. Orion is a mature spacecraft. The only component of Artemis missions that is not mature is Starship. Lunar Gateway is not technically required, at least not for the early missions like Artemis 3. Orion can dock directly with the HLS system and then pick up the astronauts after the visit to the moon is complete. And by the way, Dumbacher is not alone. Many spaceflight experts have said the same thing to Congress in recent months, and given recent events with Starship, it looks like that they're probably right. Although I'm confident that Starship will eventually be a mature and groundbreaking system that will revolutionize human spaceflight, it's obviously still years away from getting to that point. And the testimony that Professor Dumbacher gave to Congress is obviously dispiriting, casting a shadow over projected flights not only to the moon, but also to Mars. So what's the answer? Well, the answer is actually surprisingly obvious. Although the Forbes article recommends going with Robert Zubrin's concept of a mini Starship, a simpler system that requires less refueling or perhaps no refueling at all to get to the moon and could definitely get the job done for just a few astronauts, a system that is far closer to maturity right now is the Dynetics Alpaca. As a matter of fact, this reusable lander achieved its preliminary design review, something that neither Blue Origin nor SpaceX has been able to do with their HLS systems back in 2021. The Alpaca is nothing like Starship. It is tiny, but in spite of its small size, it gets the job done. The job that Artemis really needs it to do: transport 4 astronauts down to the surface of the moon repeatedly, something that Alpaca was always designed to do, and something that Starship is frankly a bit overqualified to do. Now, what you're looking at right now is the deployment of Alpaca and the Orion spacecraft via 2 separate SLS launches, but Alpaca is so small that it doesn't require an SLS to get it out to lunar orbit. A Vulcan Centaur can do the job as well. So Orion docks with the Alpaca in orbit. Alpaca brings the astronauts down to the surface of the moon. Originally, Alpaca had disposable drop tanks that were necessary to carry enough fuel for the descent down to the lunar surface, with enough fuel on board to carry out the ascent part of the job. But now the drop tanks are no longer necessary in a later version of the spacecraft. The entire thing is 100% reusable for at least 10 flights, if not more. Now, Alpaca does require one refueling mission in order to get the job done. It cannot make the journey out to cislunar space fully fueled, but a single refueling tanker, a Centaur tanker, would probably be the best solution because it doesn't require any refueling to get out to lunar orbit, would be enough to carry the necessary propellant and oxidizer to get Alpaca down to the lunar surface. So we're talking a total of 3 launches to get the job done, not 13, 12 for Starship and 1 SLS for the Orion as well. Far simpler, far more straightforward, utilizing a spacecraft that was fairly well along, at least as far as its design concepts were concerned years ago. As I said, completing its preliminary design review by 2021. Alpaca is far better suited to lunar exploration missions anyway, at least the early phases of lunar exploration. Its slow-slung design is well suited for the lunar South Pole, which is a very rugged area without a whole lot of flat landing zones. That's something that was recently experienced by the Intuitive Machines lander that attempted to set down on the lunar South Pole, toppling over because it was tall, top-heavy, and not well-suited to this type of rough terrain, whereas the Alpaca is designed to land on some very extreme grades without falling over. It was the only HLS design with that kind of idea in mind. It had many other advantages as well. For example, the current lunar rover designs, such as the Toyota Moon Cruiser, naturally travel at ground level, and Alpaca is also at ground level, at least its crew component is, and it can transfer crew directly in shirt sleeves from the landing craft over to a lunar rover. Lunar Starship's crew module is set so far off the ground that astronauts need to transfer down to ground level on an elevator while wearing spacesuits before they can enter a lunar rover. That is a far more complicated process. In addition, if there's an emergency situation where an injured astronaut or an astronaut with a malfunctioning spacesuit needs to get back to the lander quickly, well, that's a difficult thing to do with Lunar Starship, once again, because the crew module is at least 30 meters off the ground. Obviously, an elevator is required, an elevator that's not going to ascend all that quickly, and if you're in an emergency situation and need to get back into the spacecraft rapidly, well, it's just not the ideal situation. Alpaca, with its crew module being right on the ground, has the best solution for astronaut safety. And another complication with Starship is the fact that it's going to kick up a lot more regolith and rocks, grit, debris, etc. when it sets down on the lunar surface. There's no way to avoid that, even if you're using smaller scale braking thrusters in order to carry out the landing, because Starship is so colossal. More than 100 metric tons of stainless steel plus payload plus all of the fuel involved. It's going to take a lot of braking thrust in order to land this thing safely on the surface of the moon. Braking thrust that will kick up lots of debris and potentially cause damage to the ship as it's descending. Starship is much better suited to a landing pad kind of situation, a safe, solid concrete pad on the lunar surface, as opposed to trying to land on uneven, rugged, and dangerous regolith. And here's the best thing of all about Alpaca. After Artemis 3 is completed, it won't even require that extra tanker launch. Instead, Alpaca can travel inside the Universal Service Adapter, which you're looking at right now, with the Block 1B version of SLS. As a matter of fact, that may be the best way to get this whole job done by 2030 anyway. Use the Artemis 3 mission to get the Lunar Gateway deployed, get astronauts accustomed to the system, systems on board the space station, all of that, and use Artemis 4 to actually land astronauts on the surface of the moon. Once again, the Universal Service Adapter for Block 1B of SLS, seen in the background here at the Dynetics facilities, incidentally, was designed to be big enough to carry the Alpaca, meaning that all you need is one SLS launch, one Vulcan Centaur refueling tanker going to lunar orbit, and that's it. 2 launches as opposed to 13. Far simpler, far more straightforward, and as we have seen, utilizing a lunar lander that was designed to land on the moon in the first place. Starship was designed for Mars, and I think it's well suited for lunar missions at some point in the future when you're transporting large numbers of astronauts and large amounts of cargo to an established lunar base where you have a landing pad that it can make use of, but not the best ship to land on the moon. Now, granted, we have lost years of development time with Alpaca. We are way behind the 8 ball here. But nevertheless, according to all the experts who have testified in front of Congress thus far, it appears that Starship is not going to make the 2030 launch date. But in 2023, Alpaca, according to Dynetics, when I toured their facilities, was well positioned to be ready for a 2028 mission. We've lost 2 years, but if we get started now or in the next couple of months, it is conceivable that Dynetics could get Alpaca completed in time for a 2030 mission to the moon before China can accomplish the same thing before the West. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and also don't forget my merch store closes tomorrow on the 21st at midnight. So if you are interested in these fantastic garments, let me tell you, this is the best quality merchandise my channel has ever had by far, and it really helps the channel out too, by the way. Well, all the links are in the description and also pinned at the top of the comments. And if you would like to help the channel out in a smaller way, you can join Patreon for as little as $3, and that includes a lot of exclusive content, exclusive videos, all sorts of things. So if you're interested in any of that, once again, check the description. Thanks again for watching, and thanks to Dynetics for allowing me to tour their facilities a couple of years ago. It was such an amazing experience, and if you'd like to share that experience with me, by the way, those links are at the end of this video as well. So until next time, stay angry about space.